a beloved community leader takes his own life.
It was just absolutely beyond anything that anyone in the family could ever have understood or anticipated.
A family is left to make sense out of the senseless on today's Aspiring Women.
We're so glad you joined us today for AW. We are tackling a very sensitive subject, that being suicide. Perhaps you have had someone in your family or a friend that has been touched by suicide. I know I certainly have. What I find to be fascinating is that every 17 seconds someone dies of suicide in America. It outnumbers homicides 2 to 3, and over 30,000 people take their life every year.
It's incredible. And you know, the biggest category is white males.
White males.
That's surprising.
Well, I think it's the stress, don't you?
Yeah, corporate life.
Power. Yes, and when people talk about that they're thinking about committing suicide,
we should take them seriously.
We should take them
a lot
very
of times
seriously.
you're used to them being stressed out about something and you fluff it off, but I don't know if you should ever take that for granted. When someone's feeling low, you need to stop and take the time to find out where their head really is.
And also another thing that's very fascinating is that it has a dark legacy to a family. I think many families that have suicide in their family, they think, is it going to happen to my child? Is it going to happen? You know, it's a dark, it is definitely.
But you know, Christians do this. Christians do this.
Now let's meet Kathy. She met John in the 6th grade. It was love at first sight, and she never looked back. Let's hear her story.
I met John in the 6th grade. We sat next to each other, and I went home and told my mother that I had just met the cutest boy in the whole world. And I had a dance that year at my house, and I asked John, and we danced together, and I was just smitten from that point on. John and I really didn't start dating until high school, so he then went to A&M, and at that time A&M was all boy. He was in the Corps, and he began to miss me a great deal while he was in a school where there were no girls, and so he didn't like A&M too well. He transferred to Texas Tech, and I followed him up there when I was a sophomore, and we dated until we married in 1969, the year he graduated. We had our daughter Amy on our 2nd anniversary. I had Daniel then 2 years later, my middle son. Our son Adam came along just as a complete surprise. He's 8 years younger than my middle son, and that was some really unexpected blessing from God, and we were just happy as clams. John had begun to, he worked in public accounting for several years, and then he went on to work in some private concerns. But John was an extremely quiet man from the very start. And I think if there was one thing that I felt sad about, it was that he didn't communicate his deep feelings to me. And I kept saying, let's go away and learn how to communicate on a deeper level, because he talked to me, but it was not out of the depth of his being. And so we never did that. John was an elder for many years, became very close to the pastorate. John was really a role model for the young men there, because he was a successful man, but a humble man. And he taught finance to the young men and the older men that were in that church. And he worked in the nursery for years, long after I quit. He loved babies, he loved kids.
At the age of 49, he became the CEO of Luby's Corporation. How did you see him fitting into that position?
Down to the people who pushed the tea carts in Luby's, he was loved because he noticed everyone. He took time for everyone. He carried a lot of responsibility, probably more than he should have. He should have delegated some of those things. He had a tremendous amount of pressure and stress. But I saw him as the right man for the job. He had a relationship with God. I felt, certain that he was receiving all the strength he needed. He certainly had support from his family. But he was nervous. He felt inadequate. John always felt kind of unworthy. Every time he got a promotion, he would be like, I can't believe it. They promoted me again.
3 months later, he was headed to his first board meeting. Tell me about what happened.
He was very nervous the night before, and we had prayed a good deal, and in the morning when I woke up with that feeling like, when you're going to fall and you get this alarm that goes all through your body. I woke up with that. I saw his suitcases were still, he should have, been out the door, and I had actually overslept. Apparently he had turned off the alarm and looked, his car was gone, and then I walked to the kitchen and I found his suicide note.
Whoa. Now, it's interesting because one event can either make or break two different people. Mm-hmm. One person would have been elated. I finally arrived. This is what I've been working for all my life. And he cracked under the pressure of it.
Well, perspective is everything, isn't it? How someone sees the events of their life. Certainly, we're looking at it as outsiders. Perfect family, perfect wife, perfect life. Mm-hmm. How could he consider suicide?
But he obviously didn't have a correct picture of himself, because she said every time he got a promotion, he was shocked.
Wow. Well, the facts of John's death left family and friends stunned, and Kathy's life would never be the same. More AW when we return.
And I felt from the beginning that how I handled this, what I said in the days following John's death would determine the course of my life.
Kathy Curtis woke up one morning to a new and devastating reality. Her husband of over 20 years committed suicide. He found the pressure of his new position as CEO of a growing company overwhelming, and his actions made national headlines.
In some shocking news from the corporate world, John Curtis, CEO of the Luby's restaurant chain, committed suicide in a motel room yesterday, the same day he was to attend his first board meeting.
He gave me instructions, gave me insurance names, and said, don't come. He had gone to a hotel on the edge of town. I said, don't come. Just call the police. And, I was the kind of a wife that I did what John told me to do. I loved him so much and just would never think of violating anything he told me. So I called the police.
Did it seem real?
It was surreal. This was nothing that I could have ever imagined. John was so gentle. He couldn't stand to see the kids get hurt. He just had such a gentle spirit, and he really took his life kind of in a violent way. Took the kitchen knives and killed himself with the kitchen knives, and it was just absolutely beyond anything that anyone in the family could ever have understood or anticipated. I was at that point, the only thing that mattered to me was that my children were going to survive this. And my daughter, the first words out of her mouth was, "My daddy will never see my children." And John loved children so much. So that was a really hard thing. And my middle son just broke completely. My young one was 16 and at such a tender age, and but I felt like, he went to a psychologist real briefly because I was so concerned about him. He's a quiet young man like John, and the psychologist said to him, "Do you think this violent death was your father's legacy to you?" And he said, "Oh no, my father's life was his legacy to me." And that's how my children felt. They all knew their daddy. They all knew how he loved them. And so that was his legacy to them. And we lived on that. Suicide can just put a stop to everything normal. And I determined we would celebrate every holiday. We would celebrate every birthday. We would do everything we had ever done normally to keep the family together. We just went on as if, things were not so radically abnormal. And they were. And I felt from the beginning that how I handled this, what I said in the days following John's death would determine the course of my life. So I was very, very careful what I let come out of my mouth. Because he was the CEO of a very large company and it was a suicide that attracted a huge amount of attention just because of the way it was done. So 60 Minutes and 2020 and New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, all of them gave great attention to it. But I had felt from the beginning that if I involved myself in that, I couldn't have spoken with any sense of what was going on at that point. And it took me really several years to come to the point where I could.
How do you get your arms around that, really? How do you survive that?
You know, day by day. You just have to count on the love of God, which I had come to know when I was much younger. I believed that God was good and God loved me. And so from that point, I was able to give that to my children.
She's a courageous woman. The violent death of John, she really didn't go into it, but he killed himself by stabbing himself over 30 times. And so when she said it got the attention of CNN and all the networks, it was because of the nature of the suicide.
What does that tell you about?
Yes, I mean, how?
I mean, he had to have
himself 30-something times.
He had to have such self-hatred that he was punishing himself.
Right, right.
It seems so out of character.
And there's such an emotional fallout to suicide. I think that's one of the things she really pointed out for her children as well as for herself, to stabilize her kids.
She was so unselfish. She focused on them. For her to continue on doing the same things they had done, I don't know if I could have done that.
Yeah.
Right, that's true. Because, you know, I have a friend who committed suicide, and his wife couldn't take it. She cracked. A year after, she also committed suicide. She couldn't live without him. They didn't have any children until she was left alone to try to handle that. She's a really strong woman.
Well, it's always sad.
Kathy fulfilled her life's calling as a loving, supportive, stay-at-home wife and mom. How would this newly widowed woman cope with the loss of not only her partner, but life as she knew it? Some new lessons when we return. Stay with us.
So it is a long recovery process, and I think what happens is that people just get scared. They think, I'll never be well. I'll never be past this.
How does a family cope with a suicide, especially from a beloved father and community role model? Making sense out of the senseless. Here's more from Kathy.
I had kind of predetermined that at 3 years I would be married, healed, and living a happy life again. I'd moved out of our big house into an apartment. I had a patio table and chairs on the outside deck, and they were in my way. I couldn't get to a storage closet, and I thought, I'm just going to tip that glass table over the third floor balcony. And I thought, now wait a minute. That doesn't sound right to me. Something is going on here. And at that point I began to realize I was having a lot of really irrational, angry thoughts.
Did you scream? Did you?
Yes. Cry and scream, and to the point where I would be so worn out that the next day I would have, broken blood vessels under my eyes and just be absolutely exhausted from grief. I began to realize how angry I was. And I did go see a psychologist myself. I hadn't before, thought I was fine. And I went and saw someone, and the first thing he said to me was, you are very, very angry.
During that 3-year period of time, initially right after John's death, what were those emotions like? What did that feel like to you?
I had huge guilt that I hadn't put that together. Why did I not see what was happening in him? And there were lots of signs that I think are typical in particularly highly successful men who commit suicide. The stress is there, the sleeplessness can come, and in John's case, he had developed an adult onset asthma from stress, and so he was taking a medication that depressed serotonin, which is our coping chemical. He had begun to kind of pull away and isolate himself. He would often just go out when the family was all together, and we had lots of family in San Antonio, and he'd go out and sit on the patio, or he'd go and sit in the other room, and I thought it's the stress, but it really was that he was isolating himself. He felt he'd made mistakes. They were making some big moves in the company. None of the people that I talked to afterwards felt anything but that John was doing a wonderful job, but his own mind saw things differently.
When you processed through this, what do you think his state of mind was? What was he thinking?
in a suicide, you cannot know all that went through someone's mind. I tried to figure out things for a long time, and I can't. I do know some of the things that led to it, but I think in every case, you know, that guilt and just grief over if I had only done this or that or the other are just primary emotions, and they are in any death. But suicide is the triple whammy. Suicide is death, it's sudden death, it's suicide. And then there's huge stigma, and so I felt that people were avoiding me. And it wasn't just a feeling, people were avoiding me.
Right.
Because they didn't know what to say. It's even this whole thing of commit suicide. Commit has the whole connotation of a crime. You commit murder, you commit robbery, and you commit suicide. So it is a long recovery process, and that's what I think God has done for me in these 8 years. He is not wanting me so much to love Him better as He is wanting me to know how much I am loved by Him. And I wouldn't have done that. Had I married, I would have thrown myself into another relationship and never had the opportunity to develop this understanding of how much I'm loved.
Well, I believe one of the reasons she had such a difficult time later is because she didn't walk through her grief appropriately at the beginning. She focused on her kids, which was a very unselfish thing to do, but she didn't really deal with her anger. And people who are left are often very angry. And so then she realized, I'm ready to throw this table off the balcony.
Yeah, the triple whammy. Wasn't that powerful?
Yeah.
It's not just death, it's sudden death, and it's suicide, which carries a lot of shame issues. And so she had a lot of shame she was working through.
Well, the whole avoidance thing is interesting because people, when they feel helpless, they do tend to avoid. And what do you say at a time like that? I find that people usually either avoid or come back and accuse because they're trying to explain it. And we need to understand there's no need to explain it. Just be there to be a comfort.
I don't think saying anything matters.
No.
There was nothing anyone could have said to her.
We have to be so careful not to place blame, because she said you commit murder, you commit suicide, you commit robbery. We kind of lump it into the same category, like they've done something wrong. And she was innocent.
Right. And you're the one left to carry that. She was the one left. The family, they were there. They had to take that response from people and manage it. Think of what was happening in their own hearts and minds, and then having to deal with all the other people.
It's devastating. Have you ever feared losing a family member to suicide? We'll talk about early signs and important intervention when we return.
Suicide can be a permanent solution to a temporary problem, which I think it was for John. Had he just waited one more day, I think things would have looked different to him. There are a number of signs. Certainly, sleeplessness is a really big one, because men who are under stress particularly, but also women, people who are stressed can lose sight of their priorities, and they honestly are not thinking about how loved they are by family. They're not thinking about the other parts of their life. Whatever is causing this intense stress in their lives just becomes their all in all. So if you recognize that someone is really having a problem dealing with their stress, if they're not sleeping, if they're isolating themselves, if they are acting in unusual ways, as I did at that point of thinking about tipping a table over the edge of a third-floor balcony, there are things that are danger signals. And then I think if you will just keep the lines of communication open as much as you can. Say, what are you feeling?
Can you ask a person, are you feeling suicidal? I know many people are afraid if they ask the question, the person will commit suicide.
They'll plant the thought.
They'll plant the thought. Is that typical?
I think that people would be afraid to ask that. I wouldn't have even thought to ask such a question. But I do think you can open communication and say, tell me what you're feeling. And if they can't put it into words, then you can say, are you feeling like you just don't want to go on? Are you feeling like things are just too much for you?
We are listening to a very compelling story about a woman who lost her husband through suicide and the devastation that suicide does cause in families and in friendship. I think a lot of people say, I may feel suicidal? What if I'm listening to this and I may feel suicidal? You know, that does happen.
Sure.
I have a very close friend of mine. Her mother committed suicide when she was 12. She actually found her mother. And 3 of those aunts also committed suicide.
Wow.
So there is a familial fear that happens in suicide. You know, will that happen to my children? Will that happen to me? What are some of the signs of someone that might be at risk?
Well, the emotional risk factors are depression, of course. And, you know, depression can be triggered emotionally or physiologically. And you need to know that. If you were abused as a child, hopelessness, loss, isolation, low self-esteem,
That's a huge one,
self-hatred,
which is
huge.
probably the case with Kathy's husband.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, you know, I know that people might be having some issues themselves, or you may have family members that you're really worried about. Now is the time to be concerned, not when it's too late.
And there's always hope.
Yeah.
There's always hope. Didn't you love when she said, if he would have just waited one more day?
Well, that's the truth. They've done scientific studies, actually, that the situation that a person commits suicide over usually reverses within 24 hours.
Wow. So
Yeah.
it's a vulnerable moment.
That's a
is.
word for all of us, that things are not ever as bad as they seem.
On a little
Never
while
as
longer.
bad as they seem.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Henry Nouwen said, when we honestly asked ourselves which person in our lives means the most to us, we often find it's those who, instead of giving advice or solutions, have chosen rather to share our pain and to touch our wounds with a warm and tender hand. Perhaps you've had suicide in your family, or perhaps a friend has committed suicide. Perhaps you've thought of it yourself. Remember that Jesus is that friend to you. He wants to come alongside and touch your hand. He wants to care for you. He's reaching out to you right now. You are never abandoned. You are never alone. We'll see you next time.